Peace be upon you, fuckers. It's your boy, Jack Slack, Fights Gone By podcast, coming at you after UFC 242, Khabib versus Dustin Poirier. Lots of stuff to talk about. Obviously, going to be a high-traffic episode compared to normal because Khabib. Spent yesterday getting my post-fight article out for the Patreon boys because Khabib. He seems to be the big thing now. They were saying that something like 26 million Russians or, former USSR bloc countries or people tuned in to watch his fight, so that's exciting for the future of MMA. But let's do some news before we get into all the nitty-gritty of mauling Dustin Poirier against the cage. Lots of interesting matchups signed this week. The UFC hired Loma Lukbanmi, who is, I believe, their first Thai fighter. Not the Empire's fighter class ship, but fighter of Thai heritage. And she's going to be fighting Alexandra Albu, her of the ass like you've never seen. Not going to sing it today. But that's good. That's signed for UFC Ultimate Fight Night 162. That's Singapore. So obviously getting the Thai on the card, very good look, especially with the Evolve connection and the One FC connection or One Championship connection. Also for that card signed Yan Xiaonan versus Ashley Yoder. If you don't know Yan Xiaonan, she initially confused me into thinking she was Weili Zhang, because Weili Zhang actually throws cool kicks. Yan Xiaonan opens with a cool kick, they use it in the promo package, and then she just 1-2s for the rest of the fight. Very boring fighter. The other weird one booked for Singapore, and I didn't even bother writing down the other guy's name, Greg Hardy versus Bum, booked for Singapore. Then we got some interesting ones booked for Moscow, or Moscow if you're American. Magomed Ankalaev versus Dalcha Lungambula, who is a good fighter in his own right. And then Magomed Ankalaev, I wrote a piece at Unibet a little while ago. They said, who is a prospect not getting much attention, who you think is going to be very important in the future? And I said, fucking Ankalaev, that's who. And this is not a gimme. They gave him Paul Felder. Sorry, not Paul, fuck. If they gave him Paul Felder, he would sit on Paul Felder. They gave him Paul Craig coming in, a guy with no real striking ability, and who struggles getting takedowns, but is very good grappler, but also very chinny. I think Paul Craig had like 3 knockout losses up to that point in the UFC, and Ankalaev beat the brakes off him for almost the entire fight, and then just got submitted by a triangle in the last second. So that's how his gimme went, and now they're just giving him a killer at home-ish, except Ankalaev's a Dagestani, and Moscow is not in Dagestan. It's like 700 miles away, but, let's not let that get in the way. Also on that Moscow card, we got Dos Santos versus Volkov as the main event. That's pretty nice, because you got Dos Santos, old boxery guy, versus Volkov, young, cool strikery guy, who should have fought for the title by now, but fucked it up against Derek Lewis. And speaking of Derek Lewis, he's been booked for Blagoy Ivanov. Fucking hell. Blagoy Ivanov's getting into the title picture. Kill me now. And that's for UFC 244. That's in November. Another cool one that's not related to either of those cards. Song Yadong versus Cody Stamann. Really good fight. Cody Stamann absolutely brilliant against Brian Caraway. And has, he's been hit and miss, but he has the raw potential there. You can see it. He's a very good wrestler, decent grappler, very good, not very good striker, but passable striker. Song Yadong coming from the opposite side, came in through striking, went to train with Team Alpha Male, became a very competent wrestler, and they're going to be fighting in Washington for some reason. Song Yadong, every time they do a card in Asia, I go, why is Song Yadong not on the card? And maybe it's just timing, but, or because, again, we're working in 3-month cycles, and who gets injured, who gets suspended for medicals. Because we're not Bellator here, we're not animals. And speaking of Bellator, they have booked Chris Cyborg versus Julia Budd. Don't think we've got a date on that yet, but it's been confirmed that that's happening. Makes sense, that's the one that people actually cared about in that division. Weird one came out of them recently. After Sergey Kharitonov picks up his big win over Matt Mitrione, they just don't know what to do with him. So Sergey Kharitonov versus Linton Vassell. Linton Vassell, accomplished light heavyweight, presumably going up to heavyweight for this fight because Kharitonov's not going to make it down to 205. It's interesting, most people saying Vassell's going to get his face punched off, but never underestimate just how bad Kharitonov is as a grappler and at defending kicks, because he just forgot all that shit and now all he does is punch. If Geronimo Dos Santos can take you back, you're probably not a great grappler anymore, no matter how long you spent under Volkan and training with Fedor. Couple of other confirmed ones. Alejandro Pantoja versus Matt Schnell. Pantoja, good fun fighter. Lost that fight to Devison Figueiredo most recently, but he looked good for the first round and a half. And he's had some really fun performances in the cage. And then Joe Lozon's back out of almost retirement, not quite retirement, to fight Jonathan Pierce at UFC on ESPN 6 in Boston. Just hope he doesn't get hurt. And Dana White, well, we're into rumour stuff now, but Dana White says that Blan Jakobitz is apparently the next in line for the shot at John Jones. Just confirming how bad things are in that division, really. I mean, just fucking hell, that's bad. And then the other weird rumour coming out is that Bellator are planning on booking Rampage versus Fedor for December 29th in Japan. If you wonder why December 29th is significant, it's because Rising normally does a December 29th and then a New Year's Eve card, and they normally do like a tournament across the 2 nights or something like that. You know, that's when Koji had those, that bantamweight tournament run. And Rising allegedly are going to co-promote with them because Rising are incredibly stupid and didn't see what co-promoting did. What co-promoting with Bellator did for Glory. The only other people to actually co-promote with them, and they basically just stiffed them by being like, well, let's have our MMA fighters in Glory gloves having shit kickboxing matches. And then afterwards, Scott Coker started Bellator kickboxing, which you will never have seen. I don't think it's even televised. But he snapped up a load of talent just using the Viacom money. Giorgio Petrosian was with them for a good while. Raymond Daniels. Raymond Daniels and Joe Schilling are now back to Bellator MMA because they don't get seen on Bellator kickboxing. And Giorgio Petrosian was like, fuck this, and just went to one. But, I mean, who has watched any Bellator and is still excited to see Rampage fight? Because all he does is come in fat and then complain when he loses. It is Fedor, so Rampage will probably knock him out, but fucking hell, that's a bad fight. And just the worst kind of fan is the kind of fan that's actually interested in that. Sometimes when things weren't made at the right time, you don't need to do them later. There's no need to see that now. So that's news out of the way. Let's dive into UFC 242. We'll go straight into the main event because it didn't last that long. Well, it did last a while, but, it was all the same thing. Khabib Nurmagomedov wins again by rear naked choke, again in a round less than he did against Conor McGregor, which is, of course, very embarrassing for people who were saying how badly McGregor did, but already been spun in different ways. My favourite was, this is how quickly Khabib gets it done when he doesn't want to punish someone. You're like, shut the fuck up. Dustin Poirier came out with a really, really bad game plan. I said between Stipe and Dustin, we have entered the golden age of the bad game plan. And then I got a rush of people being like, but Stipe won. I'm confused. Surely that's a good game plan. And you're like, oh my God. Dustin Poirier's game plan was woeful. He came out, squared up with Poirier, and then slowly moved backwards onto the fence. Not Poirier, so he squared up with Khabib and slowly moved backwards onto the fence. And if you've seen Khabib fight before, the guy does not cut the ring well. And, it should be number one priority, circling out constantly, never getting past that black line of the octagon. Watch Holm versus Rousey. And I think the Rousey comparisons, people get butthurt about them, but I think they're accurate because she did not have a good setup for her shot. Well, she didn't really shoot. She just sort of ran in on a straight line. And Khabib does that. He runs in on a straight line, ducks his head and goes for the hips. And he ran clean past Barboza at several points. But, the Holly Holm style of game plan there, or Joanna Jędrzejczyk. I mean, she did it to 3 different people, just circling the cage, staying inside of the black line, cutting a tighter angle if she got past the black line, never waiting until she was on the fence to start worrying about being on the fence. And that was what Poirier was doing. He was doing the Junior Dos Santos thing, where it's like, I've just felt the fence against my right foot. Time to start moving. And you're like, nah, too late, mate. Idiots will think that Khabib is magic and just hypnotizes people to go straight to the fence, or is cutting off the ring, but you watch the fights, the guy does not cut the ring. So very strange. Dustin and Mike Brown and people like that, their game plan seemed to be, we're going to get taken down, so we'll just have to keep getting back up. And yes, I think there's an element of that, but again, whether it's striking or wrestling, your first line of defense is your footwork and where you are. Not even attempting to address that, you're going to your second line of defense already, which is, whether it's warfare or fighting, that's not a good idea to just be like, don't need to bother with the first line. And if you watch most of the great defensive wrestlers in MMA. When I say great defensive wrestlers, I mean, some guys get like an 80% takedown defense rate, working their way into title contention, but they won't have fought a lot of like really good wrestlers. But I'm talking people like Jose Aldo, Dominic Cruz, people like that, guys who fought really good wrestlers and never really had trouble being taken down. And Cruz, to be fair, is a good wrestler in his own right. Aldo, obviously a good wrestler in his own right, but not from that wrestling pedigree. But both of them, first line of defense was their footwork and how they made their opponent go for the shots. If you're going to shoot on Dominic Cruz, you're probably going to be diving at his shadow, to be honest. You're going to have to corner him first before you try anything. So, I think that's one of the things that I've encountered since that fight is people being like, no, footwork's not going to matter. You got to be good at getting up off the mat and you got to be good at submitting people on the mat and stuff like that. And I'm going to go, yes, but it's kind of like mastering mount escapes where you catch the leg and go for a heel hook and then not being like, I don't need a guard anymore, and just letting guys mount you. Don't start at like the worst case scenario. Do everything in your power to stop that from happening. And Khabib's footwork is a big weakness. It's a big like hole in his game. It's not great compared to where his grappling's at. Once he's got a hold of you, you're working an uphill battle against the things he's really good at. So I think footwork is number one priority for people fighting Khabib. And that's why, while I'm super excited for the Tony Ferguson fight, he's not the kind of guy to dance around and cut angles and things like that. And the more I think about it, like, especially given how much of a specialist Khabib is, the more I think that we're in a real styles make fights sort of situation with guys like Conor and Dustin being like the best possible matchups for Khabib. Edson, Barboza, Michael Johnson, he's just going to murder those guys. But the more I think about it, the more I think Eddie Alvarez is an interesting matchup for him. And I know that Eddie Alvarez is sort of on the downward slope, getting hit more, getting hurt more. But I can't remember Eddie Alvarez ever being held down for a long period of time. And also very good footwork, always very good leading the dance rather than going to his opponent. And I put that clip up just the other day when he fought Fuliang, of him circling one way along the ropes, and then as soon as Fuliang moves to spin, he just circles back the other way, effortless. And he's done it to everyone. He did it to Chandler. He did it to RDA. He did it like 8 times to RDA because RDA's whole thing was pressuring people and putting them all on the fence. And Eddie was skirting that line beautifully. I mean, it was just one punch that happened to hurt him and he managed to swing and follow up. But I thought he was doing very interesting stuff in that RDA fight. I know that's going to hurt so many butts. People are going to be like, if he just got knocked down by Edward Fuliang, why do you think he'd be good against Khabib? And I'm going to say styles. I think it's an interesting matchup. If you put his footwork and that sort of like style that he used against Chandler, RDA, on anyone, on someone who can stop a takedown well, I think that's very interesting. And again, not really seen him laid on. But this sort of brings us to the big learning point from this fight. People always say, like, well, he won dominantly. You can't really learn much from that. And I think it just sort of, what I got from this and the Islam Makhachev-Davi Ramos fight is that, and I was talking about this last week, we were talking about Nick Lentz and Saryuken and Johnson when he was out in the open, and Abel Trujillo hitting Granbys and stand-ups out in the open. I was saying that these guys, Khabib and Usman especially, but guys like Makhachev as well, have got to the point where their offensive cage work is so good that even if you hit your stand-up, which you will eventually, like at some point in a 5-minute round, if they take you down right at the start of it, you're going to get back to your feet because the wall walk is so powerful in that direction. But they're so good at slowing you down by sitting on your ankles, so good at trying to slide along behind you and take you back. I mean, he did that at one point. He did that at several points, in fact. And they're so good at getting like the back body lock when you try and stand up. And they're so good at dragging you down again. Usman, Khabib, Makhachev. If you stand up, which is the aim of the wall wrestling, it used to be that if you got up again from the along the fence, that was it. You just disengaged, and the other guy was like, "Oh fuck, you got up from my takedown." Whereas these guys just stick to you, and they're like, "Well, you still haven't disengaged, and if you haven't disengaged, you're still in a disadvantageous position. You've just gone from a disadvantageous position on the floor sitting against the fence to one where you're standing up, and then I'm going to put you on the floor sitting against the fence again." And I think that Davi Ramos really, or Hamosh, whatever we're calling him, that last round really showed that you can make a lot more space playing on your back against some of these guys than you can sitting against the fence. Because I think the thing about the fence, and I said this last week, and I said this in my article, both my pre-fight and my post-fight, is that if you're sitting along the fence, you will never ever see anyone hit a submission from there. The only one I've really seen at the high levels is Darian Caldwell, Koji Horiguchi. That was in a ring. He stuck his head through the ropes, basically, and gave Horiguchi the guillotine. But, aside from guys sticking their head in there, and these arm-in guillotines do not seem to work very well on, strong wrestlers, even as close as Dustin looked to be on his last attempt, there aren't really any other submissions there. If you're sat against the fence, you can't move your hips out, you can't climb them with your legs, you're just sort of stuck there. You've put all your points, you've put all your eggs into the basket of standing up. You've put yourself a step ahead standing up, and you will get up eventually, but you've got nothing else to threaten. Whereas if you're on your back and you can move and turn your head and your hips, you've got submissions, sweeps, and the opportunity to stand up. The stand-up is more tricky, but by combining the three things, you can hit a quick stand-up if you make some space. So there was a moment in the Hamosh versus Makhachev fight, there were several moments actually, in that last round, where Makhachev was trying to push his head into the fence, and from there, anyone, if you watch Dustin Poirier against Khabib or Eddie Alvarez, as soon as he's near the fence, he puts his hands on the floor, sits up, and scoots back onto the fence, because that's the start of the wall walk. And Makhachev kept putting Ramos in front of the fence, and I'm going to call him Ramos because it's easier. And Ramos would reach over his head and use his elbow and forearm to turn his head off the fence so that he was perpendicular to it, or parallel to it, I suppose. Yeah, sorry, parallel to it. And then from there, he was doing things like getting his knees in front of Makhachev's biceps, and then he threw his leg overhead to turn off the fence with his leg, and it almost into an armbar. And Makhachev pulled his arm back, but he was on his heels, and that's the point where Ramos could possibly roll over and try and stand up away from the fence and things like that. And he was using K control nicely towards the end, but he kept doing this thing where he'd turn his head out with his arm, and then he'd get a grip or whatever, and then he'd throw his leg up and bridge off the fence and turn his hips even more. And it reminded me a lot of what I said Nick Lynch? He's Brazilian now too. Nick Lentz was doing against Makhachev as well. Makhachev was putting him against the fence. He was taking him down against the fence, so he's sitting on the fence. So he's asking him to stand back up on the fence, or at least try so that he can sit on his ankles and hit him from there. And Nick Lentz was like, nah, and would just lay down off the fence, put himself on the mat instead of against the fence, and start using butterflies and doing stuff that way. And I thought that was effective. And the other thing about sitting against the fence is that you can't strike. And while the striking is limited from guard when you don't allow up kicks to the face, you can still up kick the chest, and you can still elbow. And the elbows have proven really effective. Felder cut Barboza open in the co-main of this, and that was from grapevines, which is a real static position. If you get some of these guys are so good at especially against these wrestlers, if you've seen Makhachev and Khabib out in the open, they because you're not when you're against the fence, they can just push that pressure into you. It's a lot harder to keep pressure on a guy who's flat against the ground because you're trying to put pressure straight down, which just doesn't really work. You've got to push off the floor. Plus, you're trying to pass, so Makhachev's always trying to go over one knee. Khabib often just stands up and starts throwing punches down, and that leaves a lot of space. But if you can get these guys pressuring in from closed guard and push away on the collarbones, especially if they tripod up, you can just drop them onto your elbow. Ortega ruined Tavares's face like that. Tony Ferguson, obviously, amazing job using elbows against Kevin Lee, and Michael Bisping sliced GSP wide open like that. But the letting them fall on the elbow and the tomahawk elbow, as Duke Rufus was calling it to Paul Felder, both legit options from the guard, and they make guys think. Kevin Lee versus Tony Ferguson, and this is why we're all so excited about Khabib versus Tony Ferguson. But Kevin Lee versus Tony Ferguson was driving a pace from underneath Kevin Lee. He was just elbowing him constantly, and Kevin Lee was having to sort of sit back and cover his head. And that's not the sort of stuff that you're doing when you're grappling. So very interesting in that regard, because Davy Hamosh had some success from the guard, but it was so late in that fight. We'll finish up on the Khabib versus Dustin one. It was kind of heartbreaking because obviously Dustin felt like this was his destiny. He said he'd put everything into this, and I think that just the game plan wasn't great. Maybe he'd have lost anyway, but I think the absolute absence of any lateral footwork. He got through the first round and then got stood up for the second round, came out, bum rushed Khabib. And I think there's some merit to the idea of keeping Khabib on the back foot. If you watch the third round of the McGregor fight, when he just pushes Khabib back, obviously you're not being as elusive, but you are making him shoot towards the center of the cage. Now, some people, like Tyron Woodley, Rustam Khabilov, they love that because they don't like shooting onto the fence because of the ability of the opponent to wall walk, whereas Khabib likes using the fence to complete the takedown, and then the wall walk is where he's at his best. When he shoots towards the center of the cage, I mean, Conor McGregor, who isn't amazing at sprawling on people and disengaging, was able to sprawl on Khabib and disengage out of range in the third round, and I think the fourth round too, the first shot of that one, can't remember, but just by keeping Khabib on the back foot. But when Dustin sort of bum rushed him, it was just constant, and like then he got turned onto the fence, and you're like, oh well, that didn't last. I think if you're going to back him up, it's got to be more pressure than it is wild aggression. You saw from Dustin exactly the same idea as McGregor in the clinch, because as soon as Khabib shoots in and gets that single underhook pin, he's looking to lock his hands behind you because he wants to shuck you forwards onto your hands, get behind you, get that back body lock, because then he can just keep mat returning you and jump on your back when he wants to. So Poirier did exactly the same thing as McGregor. He was trying to go 2 hands behind the elbow or 2 hands on the wrist, just stopping Khabib from locking his hands around the body. Khabib did exactly the same thing he did against McGregor in round 4, but he did it in round 1 of this one. He just took his hand away, punched it between Poirier's legs instead, locked his hands there, lifted and kicked out the free leg. And it's a very sort of loose takedown. It's like a high crotch pickup into foot sweep. And he sent McGregor flying with it in their fight. And he sent Dustin onto his butt. But what happened with both is that it's not like when he gets his body lock where he's basically in complete control. The other guy gets a chance to bounce up. But both these guys, McGregor and Dustin, went to bounce up and ended up showing their back to Khabib in the process, and Khabib got the back body lock. So interesting similarities between those two matchups. We're all convinced Tony Ferguson's going to be next. I mean, Conor McGregor said, give me my rematch in Russia, and thankfully everyone was like, fuck off, because as much as I enjoy watching, everyone enjoys watching Conor McGregor fight, but you're just like, I don't want to see you get a title shot off nothing, especially when you've got these guys just beating the shit out of each other all the way through that division. Like someone put up a list of everyone that Barboza has fought back to back, and it is a murderer's row. Because we look at Barboza and we go, God, he's taken some beatings lately. But it's like Felder, Lee, Hooker, Khabib, obviously, Dariush, Cerrone, people like that, just murderers. Gaethje, the life of a top-ranked lightweight is hard work. But lessons to take away: the guard is going to be more important, and I'm not talking about submitting people, I'm talking about threatening to submit people just to create space to stand up, striking from the bottom, making it an active position rather than the wall walk, which, as powerful as it is getting the man back to his feet, it is a completely predictable position because the guy's going straight up. That's his only move from there. And then, his only submission threat is once he gets up, he can try and guillotine you, but then he's tied himself to the guillotine, he's not going to break away, and his best chance of finishing it is jumping underneath you, as Dustin Poirier did and then failed to finish. And he did it against Eddie Alvarez too. Like, I think the wall walk, I think what we're going to do, and I wrote this in my post-fight piece, which you should check out if you're a Patreon boy. I said, I think the thing that fighters are going to have to do now is say what is more time efficient, because if you can't get up and disengage faster than you can make some stuff happen from the bottom and scramble up and disengage, then playing the guard is going to be the better option. If you're never going to be able to disengage on the fence, I think playing the guard's going to be the better option. If you've got a guy who just loves sitting on top of you in guard but isn't maybe great at stopping you from disengaging once you hit a stand up on the fence, then you've got to stand up on the fence. Look at it from the top side, like Frankie Edgar. He fights a lot of guys who are great at the wall walk, and he'll turn them away from the fence when he takes them down. But then he fights a guy like Yair Rodriguez, and he pushes him to the fence because he knows he's not going to wall walk. He's just going to try and throw up triangles and things. So he just pushes him onto the fence and flattens him out. You've got to be aware that different people are going to be able to do different things, and you've got to try and move yourself into the area where you can do one of those things, or prevent the opponent from doing the thing that he's best at. So turning off the fence, getting you back to the floor, using butterfly hooks, using knee shields, things like that, I'm very, very interested in against Khabib and Makhachev in the future. And Usman by extension. Leon Edwards, amazing wall walker and clinch fighter, but it didn't matter how well he was doing against Kamaru Usman if he was still on the fence and not able to disengage. And I think that's the big thing about the elbows from the guard. Like, there are no elbows from the guard equivalent when you're trying to wall walk. There's nothing that you can do to make stuff happen and accumulate some damage while you're trying to make stuff happen. And then, of course, the other main point is footwork. Footwork is going to be the most important thing for anyone who's not Tony Ferguson fighting Khabib Nurmagomedov. And the other interesting thing that I was thinking about after this is I can't recall that many occasions where Tony Ferguson wall walked. He is in love with his bottom game. He loves playing the guard. I've seen him get up from underneath guys, but I haven't seen him do that, like, scoot the butt to the fence and just force your way up stuff. I've seen him more elbow and kick guys and threaten submissions and then scramble up with just a basic technical stand-up. I mean, I'm going to have to rewatch a load of his fights now, but recently, at least, that's what I can recall. So that's those two fights. Oh, sorry, we didn't even talk about the striking in the Makhachev versus Ramos fight, because that was the majority of the fight. I thought that Makhachev looked really good. Ramos looked game, but did not understand that just that little drop away to the left as a southpaw was making it impossible for him to hit Makhachev with follow-ups. He really needed to make some distance first, maybe double jab, maybe low kick to keep him in place, things like that. It was just, we did a Filthy Casuals mini guide to Lomachenko the other day, and it's exactly the same angle, just dropping away on that little off to the left if you're a southpaw. Just makes it very difficult for the opponent to follow you. And then Makhachev was landing nice left straights, good jabs. Normally does good work with his left leg. Wasn't doing as much of that in this fight. But there was an interesting moment where he was trying to do the lead hand uppercut to left straight. Beautiful little setup. You've seen everyone from McGregor to Marvin Hagler to Nazim Hamed do it. Frank Mir did it 28 times against Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, and everyone was like, oh my god, what an amazing striker, but he literally did the same thing 28 times and nothing else. But the thing that happened was that it worked the first time, lifting Ramos's head onto the path of left straight, but he got hit with a hard jab in the face and dropped to a knee the second time. And that happened because he wasn't getting his head out the window. If you watch, McGregor does it really pronouncedly, obviously. But even Hagler and Nazim Hamed, they lean out the window, so past the opponent's lead shoulder, and then they hop alongside the lead foot. So they're taking a little angle as they do it, whereas Makhachev was doing it straight down the center, so his head was always there. And anytime you use an uppercut, even a little lead uppercut like that, your hand has to drop before it comes up again. So there is that moment of opening for a straight line blow. But otherwise, great work by Makhachev. Paul Felder versus Edson Barboza. I had a lot of fun with this one. Makhachev versus Ramos was a sort of slow burner. Nothing happened in the first round. Second round was a little bit more interesting on the feet. Third round was interesting ground stuff. Paul Felder versus Edson Barboza, despite them training together a lot and having fought once before, they actually got into it pretty quick, I thought, where a lot of guys who that is the case about, they'd be like, I'll just try and get a few points ahead or whatever. But Felder immediately takes the low kick and tries to spin into the back fist, and then does it again seconds later. That was his move all fight. I was like, that's pretty cool. It's not working that great, but it's pretty cool. And we said before this fight, like, Paul Felder's pressure isn't really pressure. He just sort of lumbers after people. Really obvious against James Vick. James Vick allergic to pressure. Paul Felder really struggling to apply it well, just sort of plodding after him. But what I noticed in this fight was that he actually found a sort of middle ground. He's getting there. And Duke Rufus was screaming comeback in 3s and 4s. And when he did, it worked really well. Did well from his head pin against the fence, which we said would be a good option. But it was Barboza who hit the takedown early, and Felder who hit the elbows from the bottom and then went for the armbar. I like Felder going for the back fist as much as he can, because he's one of 3 people in the UFC, 3 people, and there have only been 3 spinning back fist knockouts in the UFC. So why not, if you're known for it? But Paul Felder's variety really impressed me. And when you've got variety, one of the things that can happen, you can find something that works and then completely ignore it because you're trying to do as many things as possible. But by using his variety, Paul Felder surprised me and even himself, it seemed, by finding his jab. Because Paul Felder, I don't really know him for his jab. I know him for his powerful kicks, his good elbows, things like that. But never the jab. And his jab, as Edson Barboza slowed down a bit from that first round super explosion power, as he slowed down a bit, the jab was landing more, and Felder really came to lean on it more. And I was very impressed by that, because it's one thing to have variety, it's another thing to actually say, okay, well, that's working. put some more effort into that and take some, less elbows and knees and things, and we'll just focus on the jab a bit more. That's the mark of a savvy fighter. I was going to say savvy vet, but you can get to be a veteran and not learn that. But then it really started to look like that Beneil Dariush fight before the knee. Edson Barboza would jog around the cage a little bit, get set to kick, because he needs to be set to kick. He has to get in his stance to hit that beautiful switch kick. Not so much with the wheel kick, but he does set himself up first. And every time he's set, Beneil Dariush would just pop him with a short jab. And it wasn't like a big hurting blow, but it rattled Barboza to the point that he was like, fuck it. And then he'd break his stance and circle around the cage again, and then he'd stop again, and then Beneil Dariush would jab him again. And that was the pattern that they got into in that fight. And that's what happened in the last round and a half of this one. Felder was just popping him with this jab. Lots of people unhappy about the decision, not least Edson Barboza, who's told the press that he's appealing it. I think that's silly. Why bother? Because that well, they didn't even have an athletic commission for this one. The UFC's not going to overturn it, for sure. I always just think that that's such a waste of time. Like, the only occasions that I've seen where guys should be appealing are things like Melvin Gillard versus Derek Campos, where a headbutt literally knocked him out. Or, egregious refereeing errors. But then, even then, if it's a commission, they're never going to accept that. It just makes you look bitter. And, I can understand a little bit, because Edson Barboza has had such a hard time in recent years. And all these wins matter. But good on Paul Felder. I was a little bit pleased, to be honest, because I think Paul Felder might have a higher ceiling than Edson Barboza, because Edson Barboza's big flaw is so obvious. And Felder, as much as he's known as a striker, I think he's better as a sort of like brawling clinch fighter almost. His work with elbows and knees from the headpin is absolutely fantastic. And I've not really seen anyone try and hold him down. So I'm very interested to see how he does against the guys who do try and do that. Has he ever fought Khabib? Because Khabilov's not really Khabib light. They're completely different fighters. But at least you'd be able to see him against a guy who's desperately trying to keep him down. At any rate, a move into the legitimate top 10 for Paul Felder, who's been working towards it for a while. Had that weird short notice fight with Mike Perry for no reason. Lost his fight with Al Iaquinta because Al Iaquinta got the title fight on short notice because Paul Felder wasn't ranked high enough. So good on Felder. So what else did I see on this card that was good? Blades versus Shamil. I'm not even going to bother the second name. Yeah, fair enough. It's just Curtis Blades being Curtis Blades. We know he's good enough to do this stuff to people, but we also know that he's got problems with guys who can actually, the few heavyweights who are actually good technically, he has a lot of trouble with. Joanne Calder would beat Andrea Lee by a split decision, which I thought was going to go the other way, but fair enough. Andrea Lee in the middle of her, she's a very confused individual. Married to a Nazi, but wears the hammer and sickle stuff at weigh-ins. You're like, you are a very confused person. Diego Ferreira, oh fucking hell, this was a boy-making performance here, lads. Because I spoke about it before, but Diego Ferreira's sort of come out of nowhere. He looked like just a sloppy dude with a weird afro against Dustin Poirier. And that's only like 5 fights ago, but it's years and years ago. For Dustin Poirier, it's like 15 fights ago. But he has become so good. His who was his last one? Rustam Khabilov, yeah. And he looked really good in that fight. And this one against Mehrbek Taisimov, coming back off a roidy suspension, but everyone was so hot on Taisimov. And Ferreira starts trying to walk him down. Taisimov hits him with the calf kick, the low kick. And it really seemed to be bothering Ferreira. And then Ferreira's corner were like, just walk through it, just punch through it, don't even bother trying to check it. And he started doing it, and it was working, because obviously kicking while backing up is hard, and if you come down the centre with the right straight while they're kicking, it really puts them off kicking. And by the end, he was just running Taisimov ragged. Really good stuff. Popping the double jab, he'd jab, and then he'd step back into a southpaw stance and drop off to a 45 angle behind his shoulder, come back with a left straight from his southpaw stance or a right hook. Really nice stuff, because Taisimov, dangerous hitter, like really powerful guy, and knows what he's doing. He's not like just sloppy either. It's not like Dustin Poirier when Ferreira met him, but Ferreira looks really good. Absolutely brilliant performance. Did land a few illegal headbutts, obviously deliberately. There was one along the fence when he was on a single or something like that, and he just put his head into the chest and then jumped up like fireman Jim Flynn against Jack Johnson. Look that one up. You'll like that. And there was earlier in the fight than that, I had gone, oh, did he just try and headbutt him? Because he threw like a 1-2, and then he came in for the double collar tie, putting his hands around the back of Taisamov's head, but he drove like the top of his head right into the front of Taisamov's face. And I was going, that's one you can get away with, because it looks legitimately like you're just trying to not tie clinch, I hate that phrase. Well, you're just trying to double collar tie him. But if you drive your head in with it, you can just basically pull yourself into a headbutt. So, boy, Diego Ferreira, next time he fights, Filthy Casuals Guide, I promise you. Because I love improvement stories. I was thinking about doing Felder Free this week. Guys who, because there are guys who come into the sport who are already so good that you're like, fucking hell, they're just going to blitz to the top. But there are guys who come into this sport and hit a wall and you're like, well, I can't see him doing that much better. And they exceed your expectations by so much that you're like, well, even if you're not the best in the world outright, that's fucking incredible what you've done. And I think Ferreira's in that situation. And Dustin Poirier, easily in that situation. He's up there with Mark Hunt in his resurgence as one of those most impressive ones. What else did I see? Oh my god, that Otman Azaita versus Teemu Pacallen, that was rough. Overhand across the top of the jab, and Pacallen was just putting that jab out there, letting him basically line it up over and over again. Took some really hard, it was one of those ones where the guy takes a couple of punches on the way out of a double collar tie or whatever, and just takes him on the chin, and they turn his head around, and you can see his eyes sort of glazed, and him being like, did I just get hit in the face? And then you were like, oh, he's pretty much done now. And a minute or so later, he got knocked out. Rough for Pacallen, because he's just come back off that long injury. Shame, Bilal Muhammad versus Takeshi Sato. Bilal Muhammad got one of the performances of the nights for this. And I was just watching this going, yeah, it's good, but I think if he did that against Vicente Luque, he'd just get starched outright again. Because he did the same combination. It was Frank Mir-esque. It did the same combination 28 times. Right straight to the body, left hook to the head. And he's against a southpaw in Sato. And he did it over and over again. And he was leading with his chin the entire time. And you were going, that's exactly how you ran onto that check hook from Vicente Luque. Vicente Luque is going to keep knocking dudes out like that. Never mind if he gets to a title or not. If he sticks around in the UFC, there are so many guys who run with their chin out like that. Just being able to throw that left hook out on the end of everything is going to knock out dudes. And he did it to Bilal Muhammad and Chad Lepre exactly the same way. It was a throwaway punch, and they just kept running onto it. But, fair play to Muhammad. He got his first submission finish, and I think his first finish in the UFC. He's a good fighter. He just doesn't finish, which is very strange. It's like in boxing. There are levels of punching power, but there are very few people who have remarkable punching power. And when I say remarkable, I mean in either direction. People who hit remarkably hard, or people who don't hit at all hard. It's always impressive when someone hits very hard, but it's also impressive when guys like Paulie Malignaggi, who really couldn't punch their way out of a paper bag, but they're still beating people in this sport of punching people in in the face. And you're going, how? Are you doing that? It's incredible. So Bilal Muhammad, remarkable as someone who never finishes fights, but actually got a finish here. Muslim Salikov, I think this is the last one I'll talk about today, actually, because Muslim Salikov really impressed me in this one. He's had a couple of fights in the UFC. He got a knockout at some point. He's been all right, but this really was just a career-making performance in front of an enormous audience, basically. And a lot of those are Russian too, so good on him doing it on this card. But he's former king of Sanda or whatever it's, Sanshao. Fighting Nordin Taleb. We said before the fight it'd be interesting to see if he can catch some of these Taleb kicks and counter with some trips and stuff. But instead, he just petrified. He paralyzed Taleb with counters. Every time Taleb came in with a jab or something, he'd drop back onto his right foot and then come back with a kick. And he did it with low kicks, and then later in the fight he did it with a back kick. It was absolutely beautiful. And Taleb was at this point where he was like, I'm not going to follow up on anything. I'll just feint or I'll jab. And you're going, your whole thing is being big, because he looked bigger than Salikov, but being a big, powerful kicker who kicks hard often. And he just didn't throw a single kick because he was so thrown off by Salikov. So Salikov realizes he's not doing anything, moves him onto the fence, gives him a jab to the body. He'd hit him with a couple of body jabs already. And then as Taleb is circling around the cage, he just gives him a little shoulder feint and then throws the right overhand, and Taleb circles into it, gets starched. We love an overhand along the fence. Roy Nelson's entire heavyweight career in the UFC was that. If you get a guy to the fence and let him out one side and it's your overhand side, he'd stand slightly closer on his left side so that they would go out to his right side, and then he'd throw like a straight arm swing and crack him on the chin. It works very well. It works very well. Anyway, that's the weekend's fights. I thought they were very cool. There was some Bellator stuff on. It was terrible, as it often is. Nongo fought 2 for 1, which was nice. Basically, one's card was in Vietnam, which I believe has outlawed MMA, or at least Arnaud Laponte was telling me that on Facebook. But basically, it meant that they got a 4-ounce glove kickboxing / Muay Thai card, which was great fun, and Nongo on it. So that's good. Bellator had Ryan Bader defending his title against Czech Congo. Thumb to the eye, ruled a no contest. If you want to know how bad the Bellator heavyweight division is, and has historically been, 66% of title defenses in the Bellator heavyweight division have been against Czech Congo. That's an actual fact, because no heavyweight champion in Bellator has ever won it from the previous heavyweight champion, and the only defenses have been against Eric Prindle once, and then Czech Congo twice, about 5 years apart. So yeah, 45-year-old Czech Congo breaks Ryan Bader's winning streak by getting no contest. There was some fights in the bantamweight or featherweight Grand Prix or whatever it was, and there was a nice flying knee knockout. That's all you need to know. And a guy snapped his shin on a Czech, which is becoming more and more prevalent. You know, it used to be that was like, oh my god, but now we're just like, oh yeah, that happens all the time. Yeah. So anyway, I wrote a big article post-fight about all this stuff, detailing the specifics of like the guard positions that I was saying were useful, and the interesting striking stuff. It's on the Fight Primer. If you're a Patreon boy, just go click it. If you're not a Patreon boy, consider becoming a Patreon boy, because it allows me to do this podcast. If you want to see what I'm writing anytime, fightprimer.com. Oh, and send any questions you have for the podcast, fightsgonebypodcast@gmail.com. I'm your boy Jack Slack, and fuck the UFC for letting Ramzan Kadyrov sit in the crowd.